Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 14th of April, where we are discussing A Raisin in the Sun. One of the things about A Raisin in the Sun is that the film version that we saw, as you know, is very similar to the text, but there are some differences. There are usually some cuts that are made because of length and because of the cost of adding actors on and so forth. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and next class we'll talk a little bit about our second paper. And I am working on those papers that would have been submitted past the deadline that I had given you, so that you should be receiving those shortly. And in terms of the second paper, it's going to be very similar to the first paper, the distinction being that you would be writing about drama. And you might elect to write about a text, or you might elect to write about a film. And there's a slightly different way to proceed with both of those, because if you're talking about film, then ultimately you are going to be talking about things like cinematography and actors and so forth. But regardless, whether or not you discuss the film dramatizations we saw or whether or not you discuss the texts that we've read, my topics are the same. You're discussing either the canon or talking a little bit about contemporary relevance. If neither of those are of interest to you, you can always create your own essay topic. You just need to have the topic approved by me. And one of the things that I really appreciate about A Raisin in the Sun is how incredibly deliberate it is. Lorraine Hansberry's stage directions, for instance, which you would never see in a production, are just as meticulous as the writing that she gives us. Just the first line itself. The younger living room would have been a comfortable and self-ordered room if it were not for a number of indestructible contradictions to this state of being. And this entire text is about indestructible contradictions. So right there and then, she's giving us the theme. And she continues on by saying its furnishings are typical and undistinguished. And their primary feature now is they've had to accommodate the living of too many people for too many years, and they are tired. And I love the personification there about making the furniture feel tired to reflect the title of the play comes from a poem, which again you might not know if you were watching a production, but you would know if you were reading the text. The poem is by Langston Hughes, a very famous black poet, and it is entitled Harlem. And its first line reads, "What happens to a dream deferred?" And the entire play is about dreams that are deferred. So this poem works quite nicely for the thematic elements of the poem or of the drama, but also it will provide the title. And I'll read the poem to you. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry out like a raisin in the sun? Or does it fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? And of course, the idea of a raisin in the sun, which is unusual, and the fact that this poem really anticipates what we are going to be seeing with so many of these characters drying out like a raisin in the sun. A raisin is already a grape that has been dried out, but if it is continued to be dried out, it loses all of its nourishment and is not edible anymore. And this family's dreams are drying out. Or festering like a sore and running, the idea of disease and decay, which we see it eating up Walter almost alive. His mother even says something to that effect. Stinking, like something that's rotten or rotten meat. Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet. And if you've ever had something that's too sweet so that it's uncomfortable, you might understand how that might be related to a scene that is not included in the film, again because of time and economics. But while it's easy enough to delete it, I think it's quite important in terms of our understanding the play. And the scene happens to be with a neighbor. Her name is Mrs. Johnson. And I just wanted to go through that scene with you a little bit to indicate how Lorraine Hansberry shows that this family is receiving pushback, not just from outsiders, but also from their own neighbors. Mrs. Johnson, and Johnson is a very common last name, so this could be seen as a very common example of the nosy neighbor, which is what Miss Johnson is, as she comes over to the house and says that she's supportive of the family, but the reality is she's anything but. And the fact is that Miss Johnson is envious of this family, and also it takes great delight in calling it to their attention that what they are doing by moving into an all Caucasian neighborhood is quite dangerous, and there will probably be consequences, perhaps even violent consequences, because of that. Now, Mrs. Johnson's full name, and Lorraine Hansberry is a master with giving us names, is Mrs. Wilhelmina Othella Johnson, and I had just suggested that Johnson is a common surname. Wilhelmina is supposed to be reminiscent of Will, specifically Will Shakespeare, because Othella is supposed to bring forth images of Shakespeare's tragedy Othello, but Othello is the male version, Othella is the female version of a Shakespearean play that happens to be about a Moor, a black Moor, who marries a Caucasian woman and the racial fallout from that. So Shakespeare was quite contemporary for his time. And Mrs. Johnson comes over and talks a little bit about how it seems that Ruth is awfully pregnant. In fact, one of the things that we hear about Miss Johnson in the stage directions, she's a rather squeaky, wide-eyed lady. For me, this is on page 99 of the version that I ordered. Of no particular age, with a newspaper under her arm. And this is a woman who decided long ago to be enthusiastic about everything in life. She's inclined to wave her wrist vigorously at the height of the exclamatory comments. And Johnson actually reaches out to Ruth and says, "Ain't you starting to poke out none yet?" And Johnson mugs with delight at the overfamiliar remark, and her eyes dart around looking at the crates. And she says, "Oh, we're getting ready around here, though. Yes, sir. I'm telling the youngers is really getting ready to move on up a little higher. Bless God." And then she asks where Walter is, and she says that he gets his beauty rest. She asks where Benny is, and she's told that Benny's in bed, and she suggests that perhaps Benny is pregnant. And she says she can't stay for more than a minute, but of course she doesn't leave. And then she leaves all kinds of hints about how she'd like her good night coffee, her midnight coffee. And then she says, "Ain't it something how bad these here white folks is getting here in Chicago? Lord, you're getting to think you're right down in Mississippi, 'cause I think it's wonderful how our folks keep on pushing out." And she says this with a tremendous and rather insincere sense of melodrama. You hear about how those Negroes around here talking about how they don't go where they ain't wanted and all that, but not me, honey. Wilhelmina Othello Johnson goes anywhere, anytime she feels like it. Yes, I do. Well, if we left it up here to these here crackers, these poor ends, and I won't say the word, but she does. And then, of course, she shows them the paper about perhaps being bombed out of Clybourne Park. Finally, when she leaves, the line that we're given that I think encapsulates the entire episode with Mrs. Johnson. This is from Benita. "Mama, if there are two things we as a people have got to overcome, one is the Ku Klux Klan, the other is Mrs. Johnson." So, some of the other scenes that aren't included, but I think they also are important. One of them happens to be where Ruth and Mom and Benita are speaking, and Travis is outside. They look out the window and find out that he's playing with a street rat. And Travis comes in all excited and says, "Mama, you should have seen the rat, big as a cat, honest. Golly, that rat was really cutting." And Bubba caught him with his heel, and the janitor, Mr. Barnett, got him with a stick, and then they got him in a corner, and bam, bam, bam. And he was still jumping around and bleeding like everything, too. Like there's rat blood all over the street. And Benita and everyone else is horrified, and Travis is told to go back outside and play, but not with any rats. And, of course, we were talking about dreams and how the poem sets up the thematic idea of deferred dreams. This play very much is an indicative play of the American dream. And the American dream, of course, is home ownership, which we see through Mama. And it also is the 2.3 children. I've always wanted to see the point 0.3 child myself. And playing with a puppy. And instead, Travis is not playing with a puppy. He's playing with a rat, not in the backyard, but in the street. So this goes to show how dire the family situation is. And yet, another episode is about Walter. The characters are quite complex in a way that we haven't seen with previous dramas, and they are multi-layered. And while there are many negative qualities to Walter, one of the more positive ones that isn't highlighted in the film version we saw is when he's speaking with Travis and telling Travis that one day he's going to make a business transaction so that he's going to come home when Travis is about 17 years old. This is about page 108. And he's going to say, actually, this. I'll come up the steps to the house, and the gardener will be clipping away at the hedges. He'll say, "Good evening, Mr. Younger." And I'll say, "Hello, Mr. Jefferson. How are you this evening?" And I'll go inside. Ruth will come downstairs, meet me at the door. We'll kiss each other. She'll take my arm. We'll go up to your room and see you sitting on the floor with the catalogs of all the great schools in America around you. And I'll say, "All right, son, it's your 17th birthday. What have you decided? Just tell me where you want to go to school. You'll go. Tell me what you want to be, and you'll be it." And again, two other minor episodes. One is with Benita and Asagai speaking after the money has been stolen. And Benita talks about some of the reasons why she wants to be a doctor. And she talks about how she had experienced a childhood playmate break his skull open, and she thought he would die, but doctors fixed him up, and that's what she wants to be able to do, to fix up people. In other words, we get more of a noble sense as to why Benita wants to be a doctor, as opposed to a profession that comes with a lot of money and a lot of respect, especially during the time period of the play. And Asagai gives us a little bit more insight into his character when he talks about that he wants to be able to bring back knowledge to Africa, and that ultimately he might be politically assassinated if his ideals are no longer pure, and that might actually help the populace. So definitely the text is different than the film, even though the film that we saw, because Lorraine Hansberry worked on it herself, which is quite a treat to have the actual playwright work with a film, that we get dialogue that sometimes is word for word. But if you'll notice in the notes below that I've got some important elements associated with names, which is one of the ways that you can view this play. And I'll start with A Raisin in the Sun, the actual title. A raisin, of course, is dark and sun is light, and black and white and dark and brightness are major themes. A raisin is a dehydrated grape, but it still has nutrients and it still has flavor. But a raisin that would be left in the sun would basically lose all of its nutrients and flavor. And of course, if you wanted to think about raisin as the slang term for raising, this play is all about raising oneself up into a higher position, or even raising up children, especially sons, not S-U-N, S-O-N-S. And that's just within the title. Mama, her first name is Lena. The family leans on her for support. And obviously she does act like a mother figure throughout the play. And she is loving and generous, but can also be domineering and imposing. Walter Lee Jr. And the fact that he's a junior is important because ultimately he's living in his father's shadow and trying to break free from his father's shadow. And there's lots of reference to him trying to be the man of the house. And of course, gender is a major element in this play. And the nickname that Walter is given, Prometheus, which is from Greek mythology, where he steals fire from the gods and ultimately is punished for his hubris. He gives fire to humanity, is how the Greek myth goes. And think about how Walter's trying to do the same. He's trying to basically usurp the gods in some ways, in that he wants to go above and beyond anything that seems to be practical and for someone in his position with his liquor store scheme. And then he literally steals Beneatha's share of the inheritance to try to make it happen. And think about how business ownership is also associated with the American dream. And as is education, which is what that passage was about that I had read to you about Walter hoping that Travis could pick the best schools. Um, and of course, Travis is not named after Walter. He's not Walter Lee Jr. the third. Travis Younger has his own name, representative of a new generation going out on his own. And we see this, for instance, when he doesn't buy in with the gift that everybody else is going to be contributing to for Mama and her gardening tools, gardening being so important for Mama and thematically important in terms of nurturing and representing the ability to grow and develop. And he wants to do his own thing. And even at the beginning, he's told he wants, or we're told he wants to carry groceries, which could be seen as very noble. He wants to earn money and help the family. But also so sad, and someone so young, so concerned about money. And again, when we read that scene with him playing with rats, it just hones in the point of how desperate things are for that family. Ruth is from the Bible. There is a biblical Ruth who is a long-suffering daughter-in-law, which is exactly what we get in the play. We see how she contemplates abortion, which at the time period not only is going to be scandalous in terms of her religious beliefs, but it's also illegal during this time period and quite dangerous. And then we see her transformation where she says she'll strap her baby on her back. Now, the last name of all of these family members is Younger. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about young Goodman Brown and the idea of youth and some of the positives associated with it, being innocent and being full of excitement and energy and optimism, but also some of the negatives of being naive and being blind, and both are applicable to the family. Especially when we talk about Beneatha, who is definitely portrayed as a positive, ambitious character, yet she also has many negative qualities. Her name, Beneatha, and it works both ways, that others view Beneatha as beneath them because of her age, she's younger, her gender, she's a woman, her ethnicity, she's black, and her socioeconomic status, she's poor. But there also is this sense of Beneatha that she thinks of herself as superior to others because of her education, because of her intellect, and because of her desire to embrace her cultural heritage. And we know that her nickname, Alayo, one for whom bread or food is not enough, shows how she's trying to embrace that cultural heritage. She likes the nickname that she's given by Joseph Asagai. But of course, like anything, the extreme is bad. If she wanted bread and food at the expense of, let's say, sacrificing the welfare of her country or her family, then perhaps then that's a sign of her being selfish. And we know that she's got all kinds of hobbies that she flits from, and all these hobbies share one thing in common: they're rather expensive, and they also are representative privilege. Horseback riding, for instance, the family talks about how she had to buy a horseback riding outfit. Not only is that expensive, and is this an expensive hobby, but they live on the south side of Chicago. There isn't any real opportunity to go horseback riding there. Photography, she bought all this photography equipment, and again, this costs money. We know that Travis has worn the same shoes for 2 semesters in a row. Guitar playing lessons, and again, you need to have access to a guitar in order to be able to take a lesson. And we aren't told that she has a job. We assume in the play that her hobbies and her education are being financed by her family, probably mostly by Mama, but Walter suggests that Walter too is assisting in one way or another. So we see two sides of Beneatha, being somewhat selfish, but also being very ambitious. And her nickname, Benny, that's a male nickname because we know that she embraces the idea of a male profession. I mean, she wants to be a doctor, not a nurse or a wife. In fact, she says she might not even marry. And we see how, too, she tends to flit from boyfriend to boyfriend. We've got George Murchison, who is representative of assimilation. He is indeed the son of a merchant, hence his last name, Merchant's son. And George, there are lots of Georges in American history, but perhaps the most famous is George Washington, the first president of the United States, if this play really is about the examination of the American dream. And we know that George Washington, while the first president of our country, was also a slave owner. And obviously, the history and the legacy of slavery is embedded within this drama. And George is an assimilationist. And one of the things that Walter criticizes is the white shoes that he's wearing. Again, white being symbolized or being symbolic of not only assimilationism, but Caucasian society. And George believes the purpose of education is to make money, which always makes my heart sad. As opposed to Joseph Asagai, another one of Beneatha's boyfriends, where we've got a mix of an Anglo name, Joseph, but also an African name, Asagai, illustrating how he's able to mix and combine both cultures effectively. He encourages Beneatha's cultural identity, and he believes education, the purpose of it is to help Africa. And of course, we might say that Beneatha is doing what she's supposed to be doing when she's young, which is dating multiple people. But she's quite clear that she doesn't really have an interest in George Murchison outside of the fact of his ability to be able to provide her with, well, expensive theater tickets and dinner dates, one assumes. So she's taking advantage. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does illustrate a less than black or white portrayal of any of these characters. They have much more depth and sophistication, which makes sense because this play is about basically race relations in black and white. So we know that Mr. Lindner is given the title of respect, Mr., that the other characters aren't. Mr. Lindner is our only Caucasian character. Note how he references the other characters as boy or you people. That would never happen to Mr. Lindner. Bobo actually is the name of a clown, a Bobo doll, if you know those clowns. Those clown dolls. They were oftentimes used for psychology experiments, so you might have studied them in Psych 101. Bobo means idiot, and might I suggest that Walter should never have entrusted his money with an idiot. I'm not an economist, but even I know that. And Willie is a slang term for penis, which basically is what Willie is because he steals all of the money. The plant, I would suggest, is as much a character as any of the other characters in this play, albeit not human. The casting is so important. The plant has to look like it's barely surviving, much like the family, in a pot that's too small, much like the family in an apartment that's too small. And basically, this plant needs to spread out its roots, much like this family needs to spread out its roots. And this plant is kept alive mostly by Mama's determination, just like this family is kept alive by Mama's determination. The plant needs more sunlight, and so does the family. And of course, thinking about how all of these names might be somewhat significant leads us to the question of quotes in A Raisin in the Sun. And I've already suggested some. The Hughes poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, Does It Dry Out, which is a loss of life. Fester like a sore, disease or contagion. Stink like rotten meat, that's decay and death. Syrupy sweet, fake and unpleasant. Or sagging like a heavy load. I always think of Ruth like that. And even the actor plays Ruth in the film version, we saw how the shoulders are basically hunched over to show the burden that she's carrying. Or explode, anger and violence. And that has to be Walter. And the dreams of these family, Mama having a home for her family, sunlight and a garden. Walter wanting wealth, which is also part of the American dream that each generation does better than the next, to be a business owner, his own boss, and the family caretaker, the man of the house, so to speak, especially important in this time period. Ruth just wants a home for a growing family, so her son doesn't have to play with rats, he can play with puppies. And actually, I just got a puppy yesterday. I had to share that with you. She is a little pug, and we're very excited here. And Ruth wants privacy, and this is so important because this apartment was never made for all of these generations to be living together in one space. And we know that this apartment is shared in a building with many other apartments where all of the apartments are basically stacked up on top of one another, and there's no privacy. The scene where Walter is yelling about having lost the money, we can see in the background a window of the next apartment where they're putting out laundry on a clothesline. It's obvious that all of the neighbors can hear everything that's happening. So we know that Benita wants an education, a career, an identity. We know that Travis, even on his level, wants to carry groceries. He wants to contribute somehow financially. Talked a little bit about those stage directions, and there are other quotes to consider. You might have noticed that in the film version, Ruth asks Walter how he wants his eggs. He says, not scrambled. One might say that Walter's all scrambled up anyway, so she does scramble those eggs, which is also a little bit of passive aggressive behavior, illustrating right from the very beginning that there's tension with this couple. I've already talked about Travis playing with rats, and there are other quotes about the meaning of money or the white shoes or the purpose of school, or the quote that I had shared with you about the Ku Klux Klan and Mrs. Johnson, Walter's dreams. At one point, Benitha says that Lindner's offering them 30 pieces. That's another biblical reference. 30 pieces is the amount of money Judas was given to betray Jesus. One of my favorite quotes, and I think one of the more important quotes in the drama, is when the family is talking to one another and the question comes up, are the neighbors in Clybourne Park so afraid of, that we're going to eat them? And the response is no, we're going to marry them. And how that dovetails so nicely with Othello, which is a play about interracial marriage. And of course, we've got Wilhelmina Othello Johnson referencing Othello. The plant expressing Mama, some of Benitha's dreams to heal, some of Asaga's dreams for his people and education. Perhaps my favorite quote of all is when Mama talks about, after Walter loses the money, when is the time to love somebody? When they've done good and they've made everybody happy? No, that's not the time at all. It's that when they're at their lowest. And that is perhaps a great life lesson for everybody who's watching this play. This play has something for everyone. And it seems that certainly race is a major element, but so is gender, and so is class, and so is the American dream, and so is family. And of course, Walter's transformation at the end. And the hard part about this play is because it deals with real life issues. If Walter had not accepted the money, well, they could have been financially in a better place. Though when Mama gives up and she says that they're not moving, it's not really because of money. They've already paid the down payment and had assumed that the rest of the money was going to Walter and for Benitha. So it isn't that they don't have money, it's that she no longer has hope. She sees what this money has done to Walter. And that's when she's ready to give up. And Walter is ready to stand up to Lindner and say, we're proud people. We're very proud. We're not going to take your money. And yes, the family can survive economically probably without that money. Though we know that this is an unclear ending, because as positive as it is, they're going someplace where they're not wanted, where there could indeed be violence. In fact, Lorraine Hansberry based this play loosely on her own experiences as a child moving into an all-Caucasian neighborhood and some of the pushback she and her family received because of that. But one might say that a true capitalist would have not only accepted Lindner's offer, but Walter would have done this multiple times with houses in Clybourne Park so that he could amass a fortune and own all the homes in Clybourne Park. But at what cost? I don't know how you put a price tag on a soul, on dignity, which is what the question is. Just like the question of Mama giving Walter the money. How do you... Yes, she knew that the likelihood was high that he would lose it, but if she hadn't have given him the money, would he have had the opportunity to lose it and to transform himself? No easy answers here. But I think that the play ends perfectly with Mama almost forgetting the plan and then running off to get it because that plan is so symbolic. So lots of possibilities for quotes to pursue. These are just some of my ideas, and you might have others of your own, which is what today's attendance question is going to be: to identify an important quote in A Raisin in the Sun and why it's important. And my goal is to catch up with all of your attendance form responses as well. So you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but encouraged to. But you are required to read your peers' responses, and soon you'll have my responses in turn. So again, to identify an important quote in A Raisin in the Sun and why it is important. And I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well. And we will put closure on A Raisin in the Sun next class, talk a little bit about the second paper, and prepare for our very last unit, which happens to be about poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.